On cold misted hills, beast witsome and fell, in holdings and havens their vassals dwell. Seers know the all, the start and the end, myths hushed aloud, to which truth must append. At endmost of days my nothing awaits, no treasure or fame heard from sea-bound fates, a sordid life wasted on cut-sullen ground, drowned in past smoke of tomorrows unfound. What of the city, what of the call? Mine ears now ring clearly, unfettered by all. In grey hood those troubles are shed like a blossom, fall to the ground as my deeds go forgotten. Yet more is unmade than my own petty story. Celestian watchers care nothing for glory. The waters are scattered, the land torn to waste, sky shrink past me with unearthly haste. Beyond flares of man glow the gleamers of high, lanterns as gods that see myth as a lie. I witnessed the folly of old battles fought, only stars now, the city is naught. Aside, vagabonds on snakeling trails, nights render these stories are wrenched from their veils. For the oath, for the glory, through sorrow and ache, the city, that quest to which no night can wake. No night can wake. Hello and welcome to Bastionland Broadcasting, where tonight we are doing the thing that I thought, the day that I thought would never come, being able to do a deep dive into Mythic Bastionland, which if you have not already received it is on its way to you now. I'm not going to do the whole Kickstarter update here, but all the stock is in some kind of transit going to people, if not already arrived. So yeah, my name's Chris McDowell. I designed Mythic Bastionland, and I actually did this for my previous book that I self-published, Electric Bastionland. I did a deep dive on that where I sort of went through I kind of just rambled about the process of making the book. I took a kind of look at the book one page at a time and kind of just spoke about anything that was particularly noteworthy in there. When I did that one, that took me about, I think it ended up being about 7 episodes long, and each one was like an hour or two. I think I can probably be more succinct this time, even though there's more words and more stuff in this book. I'm going to try to be, I'm going to call it less than 7 parts, but this is part 1. We're going to look at Mythic Bastionland, and we're going to start right at the beginning, way before even before it was even a thing. So that's not quite what we need. This is Mythic Bastionland, but we are going to start with Electric Bastionland. So after I finished Electric Bastionland, I have done a few things since then. I did a remaster of Into the Odd. I did The Dune, which was a war game, and unrelated to this, really. In terms of what to do next, the intent wasn't really to like make a brand new game. I originally thought, well, could I do something diving into the different parts of this setting? So for those of you who don't know Electric Bastionland, there is a part of the setting. There's a part of the setting called Bastion, which is the city. But as you go away from the city, sorry, photosensitivity warning while I smash through all these pages. There's a Bastion is the city, and if you go outside of the city, you go out into deep country. And deep country and Bastion are very much inspired by the fact that I've spent I grew up in like a rural, very small town area, and I now live in a pretty big city in the UK. And I go back and forth a lot because I have family that still live in the rural area, and I live in the city. So the sort of the contrast between city and country is kind of what I want to sort of tap into here, especially the kind of an exaggerated version of it. So there's a throwaway line in here that says, in terms of understanding deep country, history's long shadow. Traveling from Bastion, you go deeper in both distance and in time. So going away from the city and into the country, you're traveling in distance, but you're also traveling in time. Now, I can't remember if I originally meant that literally, but I did then go on to run with this idea. So we're going to do a bit of an archaeology project here. We're going to see if we can draw a path from Electric Bastionland to Mythic Bastionland. I said I was going to be succinct on this one, and I'm already like stalling at the front cover, but let's go. So the earliest thing I can find that resembles Mythic Bastionland is July 2015 on my blog. If you do not know my blog, it's bastionland.com, where I originally wrote this. This actually predates Electric Bastionland coming out, but it was around the time that I was writing Electric Bastionland. I had this concept of Old Skuntroy, it's called, kind of like old country. It's the old country. And the idea is that, yeah, if you go out into the deep country, you're kind of going to hit like the actual past, but as a real place. So I'm not going to read the whole blog post to you, but this whole little mini setting within deep country was kind of like inspired by like a kind of medieval feel. So, you got some key principles. Everyone bows down to someone. So there's like a feudal system. Civilization breaks down at the first opportunity, and there is power in the dead. Typo here on the blog. Never proofread your blog posts. Life's too short. And there was a bit of a twist here to do with like the dead, and you could have like a dead liege who still had power. Another one was that I didn't have horses. Everyone rode dinosaurs. And for a while in Mythic Bastionland, I did seriously run with the idea of there not being horses, or rather there were horses, but your steed could kind of be any kind of riding creature, and there was going to be a variety of different steeds. It ended up being more like they're horses, but you can get a little bit weird if you want to. We'll talk about this when we get into some of the specific knights, because you can still see remnants of this idea in some of the knights in the book. And yeah, you've got some encounters here to do with Old Skuntroy, and it's like knights and dinosaurs and weird undead things. I think it's pretty cool. I think you could pull some ideas from here for Mythic Bastionland. So that was nearly 10 years ago, 20th of July. there's also a post about characters in Old Scuntroy and kind of making a character that fits into this part of the Deep Country. And I was looking through this post earlier, and the bit that I really like, which I'd forgotten about, again, I wrote this like 10 years ago. One of the things that I really like is this list of weird titles. So these are like different roles within the castle. So I'm disappointed that I didn't port this over to Mythic, because having a title like Bush Tenant or Hard Soverman or Parmedon or Polriser or Left Ruddock, these are great sort of like silly titles to have in your kind of court. So that's Old Scuntroy. I don't see this as like a sort of canonical version of Mythic Bastionland, but you can kind of see the idea was there in my head that I could do something kind of in the kind of vein of like a medieval kind of feeling setting within the deep country of Electric Bastionland. Then the first post that I have that really kind of feels concretely part of the idea of Mythic Bastionland is this post from March 2021. So this is kind of when I think that the idea is kind of, I think it's kind of conceived, if not born, at this point. So this started with me just wanting to write a load of cool weapons, right? So it does have these rules for specialist weapons that like give you extra damage based on certain situations, and these made it into the final game. You have maybe not the exact ones here, but this idea of specialist weapons is still in Mythic Bastionland. So this is the first bit of text that I think actually made it into Mythic Bastionland. And this whole post here it also touches on a few things here. So I was calling it Primordial Bastionland at this point, and later Primeval Bastionland. But again, when you say primeval, people just think of dinosaurs. So I had to change to Mythic partway through the process. And you've got this thing where, yeah, you go deeper in distance and time. And this is the line that I think really cements it. Past the point where people haven't heard of Bastion, but to a place where Bastion cannot exist because it's already a dream. The promise of Bastion, a beacon of civilization that will rise from this bleak existence. But it doesn't exist. This place isn't there yet. It's stuck in the past, pinned in place with heavy iron. Which kind of, again, this is the kind of the high concept of the setting that you can choose how much you want to engage with it, but this kind of forms the basis of the city quest, which is this idea that there is this city in your dreams, and knights are going to eventually try and seek out and find the city. So yeah, so this is how long ago? So just over 4 years ago, we're at this point here. Later that year, I wrote a big, silly, sort of like little bit of prose, again, about trying to find Bastion. And it's about a character who travels so far from Bastion that they forget Bastion exists. And yeah, they only have this memory of this city. So they've left Bastion and it now only exists in their memory because they've traveled so far into the past. And now they've made it their quest to create this city that they came from. So again, this is very high concept stuff that I didn't want to put it at the forefront of the book, but I wanted to explain some of my process for how I see this game sort of fitting in with my others. And then finally, around February 22, we kind of have posts coming through that actually do seem to suggest quite clearly at like stuff that's going to be in Mythic Bastion. So you've got the Goblin and talking about like having individual monsters. We'll talk about this a bit more when we get to the myths. And this all kind of got condensed into this Primeval Bastionland playtest that I ran in February 22. And again, a lot of the things are there that would be in Mythic in the end. Everyone gets a qualitative rule-breaking power, which is true. Take inspiration from Glog. I definitely took inspiration from Glog and how some of their classes work. That's the Goblin Laws of Gaming. No money. That was another thing that early on I knew I wanted to try with. Use the fancy weapons from the Iron blog post. We did that. But a couple of things that are different in here. In this early version of the game, you actually had, we'll come back to this, you had like a quest grid that you kind of completed, like a bingo card, and you would each have different quests related to different myths. So you might have a quest to destroy the Goblin, but my quest might be to sate the goblin. So you had knights with kind of like clashing quests. I found that really difficult to make work. I still think it's a cool idea, but I prefer the cleanness of like you're all shared on the same quest and you've all made the same oath. But you know, this could be something to explore. And the realm itself was like a 3x3 grid as well, which was it's trying to make it like feel really, I don't know. It was too abstract for me. I eventually ended up using hex maps, but this grid system wasn't around for a very long time. And you had prophecies, which kind of, you know, a lot of these are the myths. So a lot of those, at least in the titles, have still remained. What's interesting is the backgrounds. You weren't all knights, but you had different backgrounds. And you can kind of map some of these onto the specific knights. So the Paladin, you know, if you look at the first knight in the book, they kind of fit this concept of a Paladin. And the second knight kind of fits the Ranger. But we'll come back to this as we go on, because I want to get onto the book at some point tonight. So then we have a few other blog posts talking about, you know, myths, knights, and that this is, again, April 22. The pieces are starting to fall into place. It takes a while. We'll come back to this one. It takes a while until I get to the idea of omens. And even then, by July 22, they're working similarly but different. You don't necessarily work through them in order. They came out in a sort of semi-random order, which got a little bit messy. Burdens are something, you know what, we'll come back to burdens. This is something that was in the system for quite a while. You know, I'll talk about it now. Is this idea of having like specific burdens that you had to clear. So if you had shame, that was like, it could basically overburden you, very much like how fatigues work in Mouse Ritter and Cairn. And you had to do something to clear that burden. But when I played it, it didn't feel quite right. And I ended up rolling that into just having the virtue scores. You can take damage to the virtue scores and you can restore them each in a specific way. So this idea kind of lived on through that. And finally, you know, we'll come back to this one because this is more about when I'm actually writing the book. So that's the archaeology out of the way. We can talk about the actual book. So, Mythic Bastionland. Whew. So, let's start with the inspirations. I'm gonna compliment the art lots as we go through, but of course I have to say a huge thank you to Alex Sorensen for doing the artwork. It's I think he went far above and beyond what we had originally kind of planned in terms of detail. He completely nailed the tone, the color palettes. We had quite long discussions about sort of how to make color work in this book, because I knew I wanted it to be full color when it were printed, but I also knew that I wanted to capture some of the spot color feel that we had with Electric Bastionland, where you had this spot color. But I knew that I wanted to work with a bigger palette, so we kind of hit this limited palette idea that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go on. I could talk all day about Alex's art. I will do it as we get to each individual piece. Selected inspirations. Some people think that I put games like Cairn, Mouse Ritter, and Rune Cairn in here as some kind of joke, because these are all games that are in some shape or form sort of derived or inspired by Into the Odd, which I wrote. But genuinely, these games all do so many interesting things that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. And because they're building on the foundation of something that I designed, and because I designed very selfishly, they're all going to be ideas that I probably like. So I think I always worry it sounds very self-indulgent to say that I'm inspired by these games that are inspired by my games. But I think because we're kind of working with a common set of preferences and often a common set of goals, I think it's kind of natural that we would be inspired by each other. So these games all had lots of cool things that I took. Kingdoms by Sophia Tinney is a very cool, it's like Monster Hunter plus like Crusader Kings, I guess, or like Pendragon with like a generational system. It's very cool. Neverland had a lot of cool stuff for running like a very simple hex crawl that kind of operates on like fairy tale logic. Pendragon, I mean, obviously that's probably the biggest influence, despite the fact it's probably the one on here that I'm least familiar with. A lot of this game draws inspiration from what I imagined Pendragon to be like before I necessarily played or investigated Pendragon very much. I like Pendragon. I'll happily play Pendragon anytime. But I wanted something different from my idea of what I wanted it to be. So a lot of those ideas made it into here. Prince Valiant, the storytelling game. If you ever get a chance to look at this, I wrote a blog post about it called Valiant. If you look that up, I talk about the game there and why I think it's really cool. If you ever see this, check it out. It's a really cool. It's by Greg Stafford, the same designer of Pendragon, but it's super lightweight, but has some cool, interesting ideas and some slightly ropey mechanics that I suggest some fixes for. So I'm not going to read the poem again. If you came early to the stream today, let's just do that. If you came early to the stream today, you would have seen the introduction that I did, where I showed off my GCSE high school drama voice acting skills. So I won't read it for you again, but these little poems, it's kind of, again, another nod back to in Electric Bastion, and I had this first page, which a lot of people said they found really useful. And I found really useful when I was kind of trying to sell people on the game. Trying to sort of summarize the setting in one page and give you everything you need to know in one page. And I've not quite done that here. This is much more tonal, and it's just about getting the vibe across. My favorite thing in the world is watching YouTubers or other reviewers try to read this. And yeah, I love it when they get to Snakealine and they either realize this is just a made-up word, or they assume that I'm some kind of old English academic and that this is actually a very lofty, archaic word. No, it's just made up. And that there's lots of made up words in this book that I put in to try to sound like they should be old words. And that comes back to the kind of the core conceit of this game, which is I wanted it to feel medieval and inspired by especially kind of British folklore, obviously being British myself, and drawing on like fairy tale stuff. But I didn't want it to feel like I didn't want it to feel like a direct analog. I wanted it to feel like this is the mythic setting of Bastionland, as in the people who are in Electric Bastionland. This is their mythology. It's not, oh, here's Arthurian mythology with the serial numbers filed off. I wanted it to feel like its own thing. So having some old sounding made up words was kind of my way of reminding myself, this is not an academic medieval old English text. This is some nonsense that I'm making up that I want to feel, internally consistent, but it is not, this is not history. It's myth, not history. In fact, that will take us back to here for a moment, because that's one of the reminders that I had when I was writing this book. I always try and keep a little list of like mantras. Mantras is a very grand way of putting it. Little reminders to remind myself. So in Electric Bastionland, we had these ones, which are pretty good. Make the main thing the main thing. I'm not claiming to have invented these phrases. All game, no history, no fluff, no lore. Try and put everything in the game. Is this better than what a GM would just make up at the table? That's a very important thing to remember when you're writing actual like content for the game. Stop adding shit. It feels so good to just add stuff to your game. Stop adding it. It feels even better to cut it out, let me tell you. But myth, not history, is the one that's relevant here. For a while this was subtitled as No Romans, No Roads. A reminder that just because I'm drawing on elements of Arthuriana and early medieval Britain does not mean that this should be grounded in reality. This is a world based on the idea of those sources, the myth, not the history, the feel, not the specifics. So yeah, it's like when you see a picture of Lancelot wearing shining plate armor, and he's meant to be in 6th century Britain, but he looks more like he's from 16th century Britain. I wanted to embrace that, but a world where that is real. Okay. So, even though this is a pretty hefty book, and in many ways it is, I always hesitate as to whether I would still call this a rules light game. Funhow asks, aqueducts? No aqueducts. Well, maybe aqueducts. Listen, I'm not going to get distracted by chat. Is this a rules light game? I think it can be. I think because it has a few more little twists, especially in combat, than Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd. In my head, I sometimes struggle to still see it as a rules light game. But I think it's probably fair to say that for most people, probably still feels on the rule light end, especially if you're already familiar with RPGs. I think if you're coming in brand new and this is like your first RPG, it might feel a little bit complex once you get into combat. But I still think we can call this a rules light game. And that's kind of exemplified by this table of contents, which is that the rules go from page 8 to page 21. So I think today I'm going to see if I can get through the whole of the rules section, and then that frees us up to look at knights and myths next time. So beginnings and glory. I agonized so much over this because I usually like to start my books with character creation on the first page. So the first thing that someone sees is, how do I make a character when they open the book? But because there's a few different options here, I did have to start with a different page, this beginnings and glory. So this is kind of giving you the options of what kind of game do you want to play. Because this game has much more of a campaign structure than Electric Bastionland or Into the Odd, I kind of wanted to open up with that discussion of, if you're going to be playing this as a one-shot, or you're going to be playing for 6 sessions, or you're going to play indefinitely, you're kind of going to want to plan things a little bit differently. So this is there to explain that. And in all honesty, I've never run a game where I started at this ruler level, where characters start as mature knights, and one of them rules a holding, and the others are in the council. In the circle, not the council. I think this could be really fun to do, especially for a one-shot. One-shot where one of you is the monarch, essentially, and you have to deal with, you're jumping straight into domain management. That could be a really fun one-shot, and I think you could make it work with this game. And then we get on to glory. So glory, I went round and round with this, but glory eventually, it's not XP, but that's probably the closest thing we have to explain it. In fact, the thing that sort of stuck in my mind is an old blog post by Sean McCoy, who made Mothership. And Sean wrote something to the effect of, he wanted to try something with his games of Mothership where you have a high score. I actually can't remember if this made it into the final box set of Mothership, but he wrote a blog post about having a high score, which is the only thing that you track on your character is how many sessions have they survived. If they survive a session, you get 1 point, and that's your high score. And points don't make you more powerful. It's just like a measure of how good a player you are. And I always liked that idea, and I kind of admired just the bluntness of it, of saying, no, you're not doing this to get a reward. You're doing this because this is the goal of the game. And glory isn't quite like that. But glory doesn't make you more powerful. Like, it doesn't make you stronger, and doesn't give you extra guard or extra levels or anything. But it does give you social heft in the world. So as you gain glory by resolving myths, by winning tournaments, winning duels, winning battles, then you are considered worthy of doing certain things, whether it's leading a warband, ruling a holding, or eventually going on the city quest. And I've never found players have a problem with that. I've never found players say, oh, well, I feel like glory should make my attacks better, or anything like that. They get it, that it's like you're a knight and you're seeking glory. And that's kind of the two-pronged poker that I poke players with to kind of like push them in the right direction, which sounds very controlling. You'll see what I mean when we get to the second prong of the poker. So yeah, glory, I'm very happy with how that works. Knighthood. So I sometimes forget that it's quite unusual to have a game where all of the characters are essentially of the same kind of class, for want of a better word. And yeah, although I originally had all these different backgrounds like Ranger, Paladin, and stuff, it did eventually end up. I eventually ended up having this idea of like, well, what if they were just like the something knight? So that you're all a different knight of a different type, and some knights feel more like your classic knight. Some knights might almost feel like wizards, and some might feel more like rangers, to use very D&D centric terminology. But they all have their own thing. And I'm going to jump down the page because that second little prong, which I feel is really important to the game, and I don't often pat myself on the back. I only have two modes when it comes to analyzing my own games, and that's extreme modesty or sort of false bravado. So I don't often feel sincerely like proud of myself, but this idea of the oath, I'm really happy with how this turned out, because just by getting players to say this oath at the start of the game, start of each session even, and having this as a thing that you can point to if the players ever find like themselves thinking, well, I don't know what I should be doing in this kind of very open sandbox, you can point to this and say, look, you made an oath to seek the myths, honor the seers, and protect the realm. And there's almost always something you could be doing to do that. It's kind of like a triangle where we'll get to this as we go on to the realms, but at any given point, you could be going out to find a myth, which basically means wander into the wilderness. You could honor the seers by visiting a seer, which means usually going toward a sanctum where the seers live. Or you could protect the realm, which means going to the nearest place that has people in it and making sure they're okay. So there's always a pull factor from one of those things, if not all three. And it's really interesting when you get to the point where you have a clash. So this often happens with honoring the seers, because seers can be, difficult. If a seer asks you to do something that sort of contradicts your oath, what do you do? Do you honor the seer, or do you, I don't know, protect the realm? If the seer tells you to kill, to like let an invading army come in, do you honor the seer, or do you protect the realm? And there's no mechanical incentive for this. I think at one point there was something where oh no, that's right. At one point this was tied to the glory system, where at the end of each session, you would kind of look at how well you'd fulfilled the oath, and you would gain glory based on whether you'd sort of stuck to each point of the oath. But I like the kind of self-assessment factor of it, where the player just chooses whether they've done it. But I also just think it's powerful if it's just an oath and you've sworn the oath, and you can break the oath, but do you want to? Like, there's no punishment for breaking the oath. It's implied throughout the book that there's like social consequences to this, like you'll be known as an oath breaker, and maybe other knights won't respect you. Maybe seers will be angry with you. Maybe you'll be cast out from the from court or whatever. But you don't like lose glory from breaking the oath. You just do it because you've swore an oath. And like, that's more powerful. Like if you do the good thing because it's the good thing, not because you're getting a reward, to me, that's more interesting to look at. So that's the oath. Virtues and guard will be very familiar to anyone who's played Into the Yard or Electric Bastionland. I'm normally a little bit skeptical about games that just change the terminology when they change to a new genre. So like if you're playing, I don't know, I always think of D20 Modern. That's me showing my age a little bit. D20 Modern was like, it was like 3rd edition D&D, but ported over to a modern setting. And I don't know, maybe I've made this up. In my head, they changed some of the ability score names. So maybe like intelligence was called like intellect or something. They changed them to make them feel a little bit more modern. As I say this out loud, I'm doubting this. So if there's any D20 Modern experts in the chat, that'd be cool to check. But you know what I mean? There's games where like the sci-fi game will have different names for each stat compared to the fantasy version of the game. But I'm always skeptical of that. But here I thought that I wanted the tone to be so kind of in your face that calling them virtues and having them be these kind of slightly broader concepts compared to the ability scores of Electric Bastionland, which are very prosaic, strength, dexterity, charisma. I felt it was a worthwhile trade. So yeah, your knight, you get these things. Squires, people love having squires. I think some people just see this as like every company should have a squire, which I'm kind of on board with. Then we are onto the basic rules. So I think for me, the biggest single, because when you look at the core of the game, so much of it is the same as Electric Bastion. And the saves, it's the same. Virtues, it's just ability scores again. The turns work slightly differently. The fact that you have to move and then perform an action in that order is new. That's mainly just to make like ranged weapons a little bit worse, because I like the idea that in this world you're kind of disincentivized from using like a bow. You should get a sword and get stuck in like a real knight. There's a lot that's just ported straight over. The things that are really new are the feats and the gambits, and that's kind of it in terms of the main changes. Recovery, actually, we'll get to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to assume that everyone's familiar with Electric Bastionland, but the core of the system is obviously making saves roll a d20 equal or lower than your virtue. Attacks, it of course uses the always hit system, which I've spoken about many times. I'm not going to dwell too much on it today. I think it still works really well. I think changing the name of HP to guard has been very popular, and people seem to find that easier to sort of internalize and make sense of it within the fiction. So guard, I'm really happy with as your kind of like buffer. So yeah, attacks still always hit. They always do damage to you, and that damage is going to come off your guard, which feels better to me than coming off your HP, because even though it's called hit protection in my other games, people still think of HP as hit points. I'm rambling on. Let's focus one thing at a time. Feats. Well, we'll get to feats and gambits when we get to the combat system. But for the basic rules, a lot of it is still the same as Electric Bastionland. And I knew that I wanted to... The temptation when you come into a game like this, for me, is to kind of rip everything to the ground and start again and make a brand new system from scratch, which is kind of contradicts this idea that I wanted it to... that it was inspired by ideas that came out of Electric Bastionland. But I've tried to walk a line where there's the familiar, but I'm also not afraid to change things where they need to be changed. And yeah, I don't worry too much about people converting stuff over. We'll get to that as we get to the conversion section. Okay. I'll tell you what, I will be keeping one eye on chat, but just if there are any questions that I'm going to answer later when I get to that page, I will kind of sort of like soft ignore those questions, so don't be offended if I ignore your question. It probably means I'm going to talk about that bit later on. So we have harm and scars. The scar system, the reason I changed this slightly from Electric Bastionland is I wanted it to feel a bit less predictable. So in Electric Bastionland, when you get dropped to 0 HP, which is the same as guard in this system, if you get taken to exactly 0, you get a scar, which is a cool injury that sometimes has a bad effect, but sometimes gives you extra HP. So you kind of get tougher and more savvy in combat by taking these scars. So you can't really plan to become a better fighter in the defensive sense. You kind of just have to learn from your horrible mistakes and injuries. And yeah, they changed here slightly in that you re-roll the die, so you never quite know what you're going to get. And what this does is it opens up a lot more of the table. So for instance, if you have one guard in Electric Bastionland, then to get reduced to exactly 0, you can only ever take 1 damage, right? But here, if you get attacked with a D12 weapon, if the D12 could do 1 damage, but then you have to re-roll it because it caused the scar, and then you essentially could have any one of these 12 results. So it opens up things like getting your limb chopped off by the chopped off, you know, even when you've got 1 guard. Deverine says, "Oh wow, I thought scars were a Cairn invention. Is it? We're going to keep account of the number of times that Yochai gets credit for something that I did. We have a running count of this, and it's very good natured. But I actually think scars in Cairn, don't they work slightly differently? I think he has a slightly different system for scars. So I'm sure he did plenty of work on that bit himself. Okay. Recovery here, you can see this is the fact that you can recover the different virtues in different ways is kind of a nod back to that burdens system that I stopped using, where you take these specific effects that require specific ways to get rid of them. Here, it's more that it's tied back into the virtue. So rather than adding a brand new system, I wanted to use an existing system that was in there. So it was kind of a streamlining thing, really. So restoring your vigor requires hospitality, which pushes players to engage with locals and keep good relations with people, and go and hang out with the vassals. Clarity is restored by consuming stimulant or receiving guidance from a seer. So another reason why you have to go and deal with a seer, because we'll talk about seers later, but I really like seers. It would be a very different game without them, but they can be a real pain for players and a blessing. Spirit is restored by consuming sacrament or indulging a passion. So we'll talk about the passions when we get into the knights. Okay, let's keep going. Combat. So the feats. So the biggest difference between Mythic Bastionland characters and Electric Bastionland characters is in Mythic Bastionland, you are assumed to be a knight, which means you should know how to fight at least a bit. Even if you roll really badly with your scores, you should be able to fight, because being a knight, it means you've sworn an oath to protect the realm. So you must be at least a little bit of a fighter. So I wanted to have something in there. Originally, I may have just had that they had better scores than the average Electric Bastionland character. So Electric Bastionland starting characters are just losers they've got debt and a colossal debt and a failed career, and you could be any kind of normal loser basically, who's just got something weird in their background, and that they might be completely inept at fighting, and they've just decided to become a treasure hunter out of desperation. Not the case here. You've decided to become a knight. So the feats are kind of the way. The feats and the gambits are the double-edged sword of how I do this. So smite will let you do essentially a big attack. Focus will let you do something special like a gambit without needing to pay the usual price. And deny makes you much more survivable. You can you can remove attack dice from the enemy's attack pool essentially. And originally it was very interesting because it's a huge difference. If you come straight from Electric Bastionland to this, the characters are so much more powerful. Especially, we'll talk about this in a minute, but especially Smite and Deny. Smite is so powerful to be able to roll an extra d12. You can really do some damage. And Deny, against certain opponents, especially opponents that are only rolling a single die, Deny is so powerful for blocking attacks that between those two, it can make you feel almost overpowered. But I wanted that feeling there. I wanted a little bit of that feeling of yeah, you are a fighter, so you can do these things. And for a while, using them drained away your ability scores, or your virtues, I should say. And that was good, but it made it feel like players would be very reluctant to use them, because it's well, I don't want to lose vigor, because if my vigor runs out, I die. And I don't want to use up my clarity, because it's already really low. And I wanted players to be able to use them even if they had quite bad scores. So that's how this idea of fatigue came in, where you can use it. You can use any of them for free the first time, but then if you fail the save, you'll become fatigued, which means you can't perform any more feats. So you're still encouraged to use the feat that you're best at. So if you've got a super high vigor, you're encouraged to use smite a lot, because it's kind of safer to do so. But if you need to use deny, you can use deny once, and you can still do that heroic, blocking the attack once. And then when you're fatigued, it kind of causes an interesting state shift where now you've lost those kind of like combat powers that you had. So you have to think about, is it still worth staying in the fight? Gambits. Again, I don't often like, I really don't often pat myself on the back. I've done it once for the Oath, and now I'm going to pat myself on the back for the Gambits, because I do think this is pretty nice. And if I was playing Electric Bastion, I would probably port these back over, even just for bolster. Because Electric Bastionland had the same system of attacks as Mythic Bastionland, where everybody rolls their dice together and you only keep the single highest die. I should say this is when you're attacking the same target. So ganging up on one target is, you kind of get diminishing returns, where it's good to have 2 or 3 people attacking, but after that, you're getting diminishing returns. And being able to use those extra dice, because you're only using the highest die for damage, using those extra dice for other cool stuff creates a really fun situation where it still feels really cool when players roll their dice together and they say, okay, I've got an 8, you've got a 4, and then you've got a 3. So it's like, well, you use your 8 for the damage, and I'm going to use the 4 to try and trap their shield, or to try and push them back, or even just to bolster the damage. It creates this sort of feel of like you're preparing the attack, and then it kind of, the attack goes off and you get like all these effects go off. And it manages to do that without having like a rigid grid system or anything to a complex series of like buffs and stuff. I'm really happy with how it turned out. It really feels like, especially when you got multiple knights attacking like one big monster, it creates these really cool moments in my games. We've got lots of boring stuff like minor actions that we don't need to talk about. What have we got? Mounted combat. Again, there's a few like weird flavor rules in here that aren't in Electric Bastionland. Things like trample damage on steeds, the fact that it doesn't work against spear walls. You can target the steed separately by an attack, which at one point previously it used to cause you like ability. I think it was spirit loss when you attacked a horse, but I took that out. Being dismounted causes damage. These are all just little nudges of like specific little things that I could kind of expect players, or rather, I could kind of expect referees to rule these without me outright saying that like your steed will be reluctant to charge a shield wall, or a spear wall, sorry. But by pointing them out, it's kind of gently reminding the referee, especially, of like the feel of the game, and the players. It's kind of getting them in this frame of mind. And like the fact that there's rules for duels and jousts, like you don't need this. You could just run a duel or a joust like a normal combat, but having this here, it's more setting, and it's more like implied like vibes and stuff of the world that you're kind of like just pushing out there. Same with the rules for shield walls and spear walls, and you got to have morale rules, obviously. Warfare is pretty similar to the way that mass combat worked in Electric Bastionland and Into the Odd. You've got rules for recruitment and, sieges and stuff like that, which are all hopefully pretty simple. But again, by including them here, it's interesting because I included that mass battle system in Into the Odd. It's kind of as a remnant of when Into the Odd was much more, not quite based on OD&D, but like inspired by OD&D and these kind of old versions of D&D that had like domain management and warfare. And it always felt a little bit out of place in that game. Like it's fine, and some people do use it, and I've used it myself, but it felt like a weird little thing on the side of this game that was primarily about, exploring and treasure hunting. But here, I think this page is much more important, and I hear more about people actually using it. And there's various ways that the book does encourage you to kind of get to that point of using mass battles and sieges and stuff, which we'll get into when we get to it. Arms and goods. So you saw early on that one of the first things that I wanted to try with this game was this idea of there being no money. It's just a pure, not even a pure barter system. Because when I think about like knights, and again, thinking about things like Arthurian stories, like, Le Morte d'Arthur and more recently, films like The Green Knight and Excalibur, the 80s film Excalibur, you know, huge influence. Um, when I think about those films, I don't think about those knights going to a shop and paying money for a sword. I think about them being, maybe they're given their armor when they swear to a particular liege. Maybe they, you know, the obvious example is they find a sword in a stone or a lake, but maybe you're given a sword by your master, who's like the knight that trained you, or you find it on a dead combatant. So I just thought, originally I did have like rough values of like gold coins or whatever in here, but I thought no, you know, it doesn't matter. It kind of matters how common or rare something is, so that you know you know that a long sword is rare, and a you know, a spear is common. That tells you something about the world. But it's not going to come to the point where you're buying a sword. And if you are, you can just adjudicate, do you have enough? Does this sound like something that your knight could afford? Does your knight seem like they've got a bit of money around? So I think it worked out well. I've not had many people, I've not had anyone contacting me saying like, oh, I need to know how much money a helm costs. Like, no, I think they just kind of work it out, and it encourages more, again, it encourages more engagement with characters. Like, if you want to get kitted out in armor, you need to go to a holding, find someone who knows a blacksmith. You need to maybe talk to the ruler of the realm, and they might have stuff in their armory. It's not a case of just finding a shop that has plate armor for sale. I really like the way that armor stacks up. I do still enjoy that. Again, it's very broad strokes, but I like that you can. I went down a bit of an armor rabbit hole here. For all that I talked about this game not being based on history, I still wanted the armor to make a bit of sense. So I'm quite happy with this system of, you know, shield is if you're going to be just a commoner, shield is the armor you're going to have. A coat of like mail and a helm is going to be if you're like a proper soldier, and to get like plates is going to be a rare thing indeed. And that's where you've got things like, you know, a rigid plate armor, splinter scale, and so on. Now, people in the realms. This page nearly wasn't in the book. The services, I had those in there as kind of like the hireling costs, if you like. But this sort of right-hand column, which has realms, myths, roles, and these 3 bullet points kind of explaining these different elements of the setting. This nearly wasn't in there because I felt like I really wanted to try and just imply all of this through the actual game content. So I wanted to try and imply like what's the role of a knight in this setting, and can I just imply that through all of the stuff that I've already talked about and the stuff that's still to come in the book about specific knights. And eventually I just thought, no, I do just need to lay it out and say, look, someone's going to want to know, are knights, what's knights' place in society? So I need to point out that they're held in esteem, but expectations burden them. And this is also a good opportunity to add in things that the referees might not assume. So things like, you know, only one knight holds each title, passed on in retirement or death. So yeah, it's kind of it's usually like a succession thing. And one of the things that I like is in this roles thing, you kind of got not quite the 4 estates, but you got vassal, vagabond, knight, and seer are kind of the 4 roles that anyone will fall into. And I like this addition that a web of seniority exists within and between each. So even if you are a seer, there's still a web of seniority within the seers. So you can play with that a bit, and you can have like an arch seer come into the realm, or you could have someone who's like a petty seer or something. And I like having those little sparks that people could run with and kind of make their own kind of twists on the setting with this. Creating a realm. I did a whole video about this, and as such, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but I am very happy with this because it's enough fun that I find myself sometimes just doing it for fun. Like I will open up HexKit and just make a hex realm, and then I will lay down a few holdings, and I'll start to generate a few characters for those holdings, and I'll put down a few landmarks, and before I know it, I've got a realm. So I really like that. I think I'm a big fan of these kind of, I know it's often called lonely fun for the referee to kind of like prep these things. Um, I like a game that doesn't require too much prep. I would say this game, it's not prep heavy and it's not prep light. I would say it is. I'm going to try and think of a pretentious phrase. I'm going to say prep rich. How's that? Prep rich, because you do have to do some prep, really. You generally do have to like spend a bit of time creating this realm, but I hope that that time is enjoyable because I find it enjoyable. You're not slogging around working, crunching numbers on like prep. You're just making up cool stuff in your realm. And a lot of it's already done for you with the myths and stuff like that. And the spark tables are all there to help you. And then when you've done that prep, that will usually last you for a good long time. If you prepare a full realm using this, you can run, many sessions in that realm. You can run an entire campaign in that realm, and like you can swap out the myths as they get resolved. You might need to create some new characters to introduce as old characters die. But yeah, it's hopefully the good kind of prep is my goal. Sites are the closest that we've got in here. So we spoke about how in Into the Odd, the kind of the mass battle and enterprise system felt a little bit bolted on. I think sites is perhaps the closest this game has to like a weird bolt-on system. But I do like it a lot and I do use it. And I know people have told me about their games where they've used it and they've had a lot of fun with it. I've seen people expanding it out into like having entire like underworld like mega dungeons underneath the realm, which sounds awesome. I did a few blog posts talking about using these sites for your landmarks, so things like your dwellings or your sanctums, like making those into sites. So it's not just a case of you find the landmark, you kind of have the area around it as well. I think I really warmed on this. After I wrote it and I included it, I thought, well, does this quite justify its place in here? Do I need to get rid of it? Because I do enjoy cutting entire pages out, but I'm really, really glad that I kept it in. Refereeing. So again, very similar to what I've done in previous books. I wanted to try and get this down to that everyone learns in different ways. Some people find GM advice that's written in like prose really useful. Some people prefer like a sort of a flow chart. In case you haven't realized by now, I love a bullet point list and I love a procedure where it's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And it's not a flow chart. Flow charts sometimes can make my brain get overloaded. But for me, this works. And I know that I've had people tell me that it really works for them. And my rule of thumb when I'm writing these games is I would always rather make something that some people don't like, but then someone is like, it just clicks for them. And they're like, this is what I've been missing. This is what I've needed. And I'm hoping that that's what's happened with this guidance, because I find this really useful just as a one-page reminder of good principles of running the game. Things like, asking, making sure that what to do when there's a success and it's not immediately obvious. Well, do these things. What about when they fail? It's so common. I see it all the time when players fail a roll and the referee kind of doesn't really know what to do. So sometimes it's like, oh, well, nothing happens, or it moves forward as if they succeeded. So having these really laid out, none of this is new advice. This is all cribbed from other places, but just having it all laid out on one page, I find really useful. And ending a session. Again, this is something that's very easy to overlook. At the end of a session, ask the players if they have any plans or ambitions for next session. This gives you direction for any preparation you do before then. Now, maybe some people do this just as a matter of course, but I went a long time not doing this. And I ran a whole campaign of Traveller last year, and we kind of did this, but I didn't always do it. And in the weeks when I didn't ask the players where they were going next week, it was a real pain to prep. Whereas if I knew they were going to this planet over there and I knew that they wanted to do a certain thing, I could prepare something, relevant for them, and I could actually make something fun. Okay, time. Now, I this is the most me page in any game that I've written, because each day has 3 phases, each year has 3 seasons, and each life has 3 ages. And the seasons and the ages kind of correspond to each other based on colors. I couldn't quite justify that with the days as well, but this is me on a page. I am very, very guilty of sometimes forcing myself to break something down into a list of 3. I've gotten better at spotting this and thinking, look, is this good? Can you have 3 phases in the day, or are you just doing it because it's your thing? And I'm here to tell you that I think this 3 phase thing does work quite well for days, years, and ages. You could have 4 phases of the day, the classic morning, afternoon, evening, night. You could have the 4 classic seasons. You could probably expand the 3 ages to include some sort of like childhood phase, then like a young adult phase, mature and old. But I just like the symmetry of having them all be 3. And I like the immediacy of it makes things move along more quickly. Like, you haven't got time to mess around with going from spring to summer to autumn. No, winter's going to be here soon. You've got to hurry up and get stuff done before winter. So yeah, I like this. One of the books that is not in the credits, one of the books that's not in the credits that's really inspired my descriptions of the seasons here is Wanderhome by Jay Dragon. And Wanderhome, it's a super different game to Mythic Bastionland. I actually did a stream of it way back. This was during one of the lockdowns. I did a solo stream of Wanderhome. It's a really cool game, but incredibly different to this. But the thing that I really took from that book is the way that seasons and locations are described. It's really super evocative, and it will describe a month in a way that you can feel like you're there. Like, it has the months all have these special names that are it's not our month names. It'll be called I don't know, Devil Days, I think, is like the peak of summer, and it will describe it in such a way that you just know straight away what those days feel like. And that really got me thinking about seasons in games. There is a more expanded version of this calendar. Can you guess how many months there are in each season? There are 3 months in each season. The expanded calendar was definitely not worth putting in the book, but it is available on the blog. It kind of loosely corresponds to the 3 events that happen in each season. But I do like these. I do use them, and I think it kind of, again, it fits the medieval mythic setting to know that you're always working towards these feasts. And one of the latest editions, one of the editions that just got added in just before it went to print, was this idea of the tax at the end of spring, the tithe, which is a food collection at the end of harvest, and the levy, which is a sort of material and goods collection at the end of winter. And I really like these, and I like to use these because it gives, if you're serving the realm isn't always about, going and slaying a dragon. Sometimes you just got to go and pry some food out of farmers' hands and say, no, we're taking this for the seat of power. Then we need to put this in the storerooms to get us through winter. So yeah, I like that kind of thing. The life having 3 ages is also kind of inspired by the fact that I read Traveller, and I think in Traveller, let me work this out, there's any classic Traveller experts can tell me, what point do you start deteriorating? At what age, when you're doing the life path generation, do you start risking getting worse through old age? I think in Traveller, classic Traveller, it's something like, I think it's 36 or 38. All I know is it was like the age that I was when I read classic Traveller properly for the first time, and I felt it's fair. I can't argue with it. Oh, 34 apparently, Sam. Thank you. Um, but it still felt bad. And I think it was Pendragon as well has a similar thing where there's like at the age when you start to deteriorate is sort of like late 30s. So being in my, well, I'm now 40, being in my mature era, um, I decided that no, it's your season. You're in your golden years, and this is actually when you're going to be in your prime. So this is a game for all of the middle-aged people out there. Okay, advancing time. I I would be really interested once the dust has settled on this and people have run campaigns. I really want to know how often people do this because for me it is like a core part of the game. I would, even if I was running like a 3 session campaign, I would want to have at least some season skips in there, and I would always move to the next season between sessions in that kind of campaign. But I really want people to use the sort of advancing through the ages as well. And I didn't want to make it like super hard line, like, no, you have to do it after this many sessions. But I do think it would be interesting to see, because I know that some people are like reluctant to do it because it's so different. I know other games like Pendragon and more recently Kingdoms. I know other games have used this. It's not new, but I think if you're coming to this from Electric Bastionland or D&D, it's very different to the feel of those games where you haven't got these big time skips. So I'll be interested to know how people respond to that. The jury is still out on that one, but I really like it. Okay, how many more pages of rules do we? Oh, we've only got 2 more spreads, so maybe it is rules light. If I can talk about the rules and get it done in just over an hour, I think that's probably rules light. Right, travel. One of the things, remember the tag of no Romans, no roads? The 2 reasons for that were, number one, although this is inspired by the medieval period, and especially like medieval Britain, like early medieval Britain, like post Rome, I think so much of stuff like the Arthur stories and so much mythology and writing of that era kind of holds up like Rome as this like the golden age that's past, and things were so incredible when Rome was here, and now we're in the dark ages of the early medieval. And I didn't want that. I wanted to sort of, aside from the fact that, aside from whether or not I agree with that, I think it's more to do with I wanted to flip it, because the whole point of this setting is that you're trying to find the city. The city isn't something that's in the past. The city is literally in the future because it's potentially Bastion, right? And you can't be looking to the city of the past of Rome. You're looking to the city of the future in Bastion, and that creates it. I actually find that more enjoyable to play with as an idea, because it adds a little bit of hope to it. It's not just, oh, we'll reclaim the golden age. It's that, oh, this is we have to go and find the city, which is going to be this amazing thing. Whether or not that's true is beside the point. The fact is, it's laid out as this optimistic thing. So that was why there was no Romans, or like Rome equivalent in this setting. No roads also is good, because as soon as you put roads in a hex crawl, I think people are just going to follow the roads. I know there's systems that mess with that, like maybe roads are more dangerous because there's bandits and stuff like that, and maybe there's incentives to go off the roads to find things. But I wanted the world to feel mostly like wilderness, because another huge part of the inspiration for this game was it was during the lockdowns that we had here for COVID, and my partner and I, we spent a lot of time just like going walking in the woods and down a river, because we couldn't go anywhere in the city. So we were dreaming of the city while we sort of wandered through woods, and just being able to like, it kind of forced me to engage with nature, which is something that in a way that, in a more intense way than I perhaps have in the past. So I wanted the game to have that feel of crossing the wilderness, and sort of like, like when you, especially in Britain, there's so much of the country that's now like, even when you're in the countryside, you're looking at like farmland, And you kind of can't help but think like, well, imagine this must have all just been like foresters at some point before this was a farm. Like, imagine trying to get just a few miles across to somewhere else if there's just forest between you and there's not even fields. It's it's completely wild wilderness. And I wanted to capture that kind of feeling. So yeah, so no roads. There's you can have a rarely found proper road, but for me, I would never put a road in my setting. Maybe a short one, because the other thing is the domain management system actually has a rule for like adding things to your realm. So maybe you could be the one to add that road. Okay, wilderness roles. So this is kind of the beating heart of the system, which is going out into the wilderness, finding myths and progressing through their omens. So you are more likely to bump into omens from myths that you are near to, but there's always a chance you're going to find myths that are elsewhere in the realm. And when I was editing the video, the introduction video for this stream, there's the effect where the myths are constantly kind of fading into one another. And as I was doing that, I thought, hey, this is actually a pretty cool representation of what happens in the game, because what will happen is if you have the goblin and, I don't know, the mist in the same realm, you might encounter two things from the mist, and then you might encounter a thing from the goblin. But you don't know which myth you're encountering omens from. So if there's mist and you hear some sort of some giggling in the mist and this weird creature's there, you think, is this part of the mist? Is this something else? I really enjoy seeing the knights try and kind of put these things together and kind of work out what's going on. It can be quite because the opening omens of each myth tend to be often quite mundane and just kind of setting the scene. It can be interesting when they encounter a few of those in sequence, and it can feel a bit like they're just encountering random things for a little while until they hit the second omen of the myth, and all of a sudden they start to see the pattern of what's happening. I went through a lot of systems for like camping, supplies, what happens if you try and travel at night. I even though this system is simple, it took quite a lot of work to get it to feel right. I am happy with it in the end. Camping and getting food and stuff and setting up camp and finding vantage points. Originally, there was a whole little system for that. But when I think, I wanted to capture the feel of going through the wilderness, but when I think about these night stories, I don't think about like them having trouble finding a good camping spot. I think about they can't camp because they set up camp and then in the night they're awoken by like some ghosts or something. So if you're gonna lose a night of sleep, I don't want it to be because the ground isn't right for setting up your tent. I want it to be because there's some weird mythic stuff happening. Same with the food. You gather food and water and firewood and stuff as you go. If you're in the desert, you can deal with that and rule that as it comes. But for most situations, you're going to be traveling through places that has food. And again, we don't need to know how does Gawain get his meal for the night on the way to the Green Chapel. You can assume that he is catching prey, or finding food, or he's packed some rations. We can assume those things. And so the sort of the punishment, if you like, for traveling at night, going without sleep, ties back into that system of virtues and kind of drains away your virtues, which is a nice system, because it's going to happen, because myths can like interrupt you in the night and mean that you lose out on sleep, and players will want to travel through the night to get to safety. So you hit this point, you get this kind of nice little feedback loop where they're going to be pushing themselves and running into situations where they lose their virtues, which again pushes them to other parts of the realm, because if they lose clarity, for instance, they're going to want to try and find a seer. So it's a nice little. This all sounds very, what's the word I'm after? It all sounds very Skinner boxy, but that's not how I see it. I think it just creates these interesting situations where you give players problems, and in solving those problems, they kind of run across interesting situations. Okay, we've got some other traveling tables. This is one that it's a weird like one to just have tucked away down here. This local mood one, but it is good to have. It's kind of like a generic reaction table, really. It's slightly strange that it's down here because the layout is so tight. Because I am so fixated on having all of the rules of one thing on one page. You do sometimes get these weird little additions that are like, does this belong here? But you know, it's part of travel. It's when you arrive in a holding, you roll on this table. But there's a debate about whether this belongs here. Exploration. There was a much more strict system here for like exploration actions that you can do. So like finding a vantage point, setting a course. I think someone had to like be the navigator and stuff. And again, that all works if you want to have a really in-depth like wilderness survival thing. But I wanted to, if I already have a system that I can use, I'd rather use that than make a new system. So I just realized, well, this all comes down to the action procedure on page 16, which I kind of glossed over, but I keep saying that like this is one of the most important things in there. This kind of lets you adjudicate anything, really. So whether it's a personal action or it's like a much large scale action that's done as part of like a long journey, this kind of lets you do anything. So I would rather adjudicate it using that and have the referee feel really comfortable using that system than like introduce a new system for like, oh, here's the rule about vantage points and how far you can see from certain vantage points and so on. So we do have rules on vantage points, to be clear, but there was a much more strict system for like finding you had to basically spend time to find a vantage point, and it was much more complicated. Folklore is another one of those things that is there as sort of a connecting myths to stories, because the myths are meant to be stories that the people of the realm would know, and or stories or songs, you know, is one of the ways that I started describing these. And as such, I wanted to have some very, very clear guidance for like, what do people know? And it's a nice simple rule that the vassals will know sort of rumors about it. So the vassals know like what's going on with a myth. They'll know that, again, the example here is like a boy's gone missing and there's stories about an old man in the woods. But the seers will just straight up tell you, or rather, the seer straight up knows this is the goblin, and they know what's going to happen. The seer like knows everything that's on the myth's page, and then the difficulty comes with what is the seer going to tell you. And some seers are helpful. Some seers will just tell you outright, yeah, that's the goblin. Here's his weaknesses. You need to go and sort him out because he's a problem. But most seers have some kind of agenda or limitation that means they aren't always going to tell you everything. So Dominion and Authority is sort of the domain management system here. Very much inspired by how light of a Crusader Kings game can I make here that still feels like an RPG rather than like a board game that's added onto the side here. So I still wanted it to be about dealing with problems, which are these crises. So, you know, you might have chaos, which is lawlessness in the land. So resolution, enforce a sense of justice. So you need to go out into the realm and, you know, bandits is the example, I guess. Go out and sort these bandits out because they're in your domain. Or send someone out to do it, you know, you're the boss now. And then the council is... For a while I had a thing where like the members of your council like affected your virtues, but it just didn't feel right for this fit. And so instead it's just like, no, these are the jobs that you need to fill for the realm to work properly, and everyone wants these jobs. So you're going to annoy someone by not giving them the job, and you're going to make someone very happy by giving them the job. But you're also giving them power. So, you know, making someone your marshal, you better make sure you keep that person on your side. And if your marshal becomes an enemy, they're going to be annoyed if you take that power away from them. So you get this kind of nice little internal politics engine that still
doesn't break down into being an actual like management sim. It still feels like an RPG situations that you have to deal with. Same with authority. Just these are kind of some like baseline rules for like how many troops you can get. Taxes in general, don't worry about taxes. You collect enough taxes to kind of make things work. But if you want to do something big or like start a war, you have to gather more taxes, and that's when you potentially run into problems. I didn't want to have like you managing like happiness versus taxes and blah blah all this stuff. No, that does not appeal to me. Courtly conflict. This is great because I like this little table. How involved are you with the drama? So there's always some drama going on. Are you personally involved or not? Conquest. This is a nice line. Knights live between two worlds, one of rank, oath, and rule of the worthy, the other of chaos, brutality, and the rule of the strong. Often, having the audacity to seat yourself in a holding is enough to make you the ruler. So in part of my research, well, not really, it's just curiosity, really. In part of my curiosity reading for when I was writing this, I came across so many instances from history where like there would be a succession crisis, and it was really just a case of who got there first. Perhaps a sweeping generalization, but that there were big instances of like medieval successions where it felt like the first person to get on the seat got to stay there, or it gave their claim, serious weight if they could do that. And then we've got grand designs, which is this kind of like very loose system for like adding stuff like roads to your realm or adding infrastructure. Which again, for a while I thought like, do I need to have a system of like you're building this many farms, which means you get this much food, and that's not the kind of game this is. It's more about, well, you're a big picture kind of ruler. So what's your big project? So you want to build a new fort on the border with this this enemy realm, or you want to build a road between two of the holdings. That's what it's more about, the big picture sort of ideas. Right, I'm going to take a swig before this giant spread takes my voice away. Right. Grimku says, it reminds me a lot of the Blades in the Dark position and effect resolution system. I am a huge fan of that system. I think, again, it's nothing new. People will say like, oh, I always used the equivalent of position and effect before Blades in the Dark, but that was the game that for me made me think about it and made it easy for me to remember it. So yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from that particular part of Blades in the Dark. Lookroll says, my group's been playing for a year and we're about to do our first advance of an age. Nice, I'm glad to hear it. Great. So, spark tables. There were spark tables in Electric Bastionland. Let me find us some. So, random game inspiration. Here we go. So it kind of started with these ones, really. Well, actually, I think it's more for each of the regions of the world. So for Bastion, there is this spark table. So you roll 2d20. I'm not going to look. Let's say 17 and 18. You roll. So a disputed chimney. That's an Electric Bastionland adventure right there. A disputed chimney. And just by having these sort of lists of words, combining them, I don't think I came up with this. I think someone else had. I know, obviously, it's just two random tables. I think someone else had used this idea before. I think I came up with the name Spark Table. So obviously that means I can claim the whole thing. And having those for each of the regions is a really cool way of like giving it a very specific feel. So I knew that I wanted to do this again. But here, I'll zoom in a little bit because these are quite small. Especially because it's a hex crawl game, essentially. And I knew that every hex wasn't going to be filled in. I knew that I wanted to have especially some spark tables for filling the blanks in the hex map. So some of the first ones I wrote were this, land, sky, water. So that if you go into a hex, and again, I'm not going to look, let's say you rolled a 4 and an 8, you can have a sparse meadow, and at least that gives you a starting point. And then maybe that 4 and 8 is the sky has a pale tone and dappled texture. So you can describe this dappling of pale clouds in the sky. And there's a lake. What's it like? It's 4 and 8. It's mucky glass, so it's a very still lake, and you can see your reflection, but the water's like mucky and filthy. And you might think, is this just absolute? Is this just like a lick of paint? Is it just fluff? And the answer is yes, but with an RPG, nothing is just fluff, because at any point you don't know what's going to happen. That murky lake could become relevant later on, or if you encounter a myth, an omen of a myth while you're there, it could become relevant to that. I think maybe those little clouds in the sky are probably not going to be super relevant, but all these things that they can become relevant at any point. So it is just set dressing, but also in an RPG, nothing is just set dressing. So it was a lot of fun writing these. It was also a lot of work, because it's easy to make 12 of something, but I feel like I wanted to sort of make sure everything was covered. I wanted to make sure I wasn't duplicating myself. I wanted to just try, not quite every combination, but try lots of combinations to make sure they work. So I eventually ended up with these, like, where you had a nature section, a civilization section for when you get to a holding. I hope people understand this holding Bailey keep thing as being like, again, I really hem myself in with this structure, but the holding is kind of like, as you are approaching the holding, what do you see? So we'll stick with 4 and 8. You see an ancient dome is kind of at the holding, and then the Bailey is when you're like through the gates, right? That's like the inside bit, kind of like the courtyard, I guess, but it doesn't have to be a courtyard. So that is a sophisticated garden once you're inside the walls, and the keep is the kind of inner sanctum of the holding, like the sort of the normally like the strong house within the walls itself. So that has a pool as a centerpiece and wreaths as decoration. And this is, I really love using these for preparing the realm. I really love this. This is just enough for me, where it gives you enough of a specific combination that you feel like you're getting an answer from the table, but you also have a bit of creative work to do yourself. If I just had, like, I don't know, 100 different types of food and they were all laid out specifically, that's fine. But I do like the idea that I'm being creative with the book. The book is like a tool for my creativity, and this is about the right sort of balance for me. Yep, so these are fun. You've also got them for people. I really enjoy the voices, because there were a few blog posts recently about this. I apologize for not remembering who wrote them, but I'm a big fan of, like, advice for doing voices that aren't accents, for various obvious reasons. Doing accents can be tricky, and I think having a character with, like, a real world accent, it can just end up being too comedic at best and unfortunate at worst. So having, like, specific voices that aren't just about the accent, I found really useful. So if they have a flat tone and a terse manner, you know what they sound like. If they are melodic but detached, I guess they're kind of spaced out and they're kind of like in a slight sing-song voice, but you feel like they're not really listening to you. And again, I really like using these. It's really fun building the characters and the building the non-player characters that you're going to run into. But it's also useful for PCs, but less so probably. And then finally, combat. This is like, again, this is obviously the fourth of these tables where, like, I had a few ideas here, and I really kind of ran with it and took it to an extreme. I don't know how often people use these. The one that I really like is maneuvers. So if you're fighting another knight, these are really cool. Even if they're just attacking, just kind of use this to like describe what they're doing. So we had 4 and 8. So defend with intent to expose. So again, they're kind of like they're behind their shield and they're just waiting for a gap in your attack. Maybe they're rushing with intent to stall. So they want to just kind of like knock you back and stagger you. And yeah, this is mostly set dressing, but it can also just be a nice little way to, you can actually have it affect how the combatant fights and whether they're using their gambits or their feats. So it's a nice little way of randomizing that slightly. So we have done it. We have got to the knights and the myths with 90 minutes gone of the stream. So I think we're going to call it there for part 1. Thank you everyone in the chat. It's been really cool to see so many people here. This might be the biggest, most popular live stream I've done, which is really cool. I will be doing this again for the next few weeks. Let's say next week I will go through the knights, and then the following week I will go through the myths, and then after that I will pick up the Apocrypha section maybe and talk about a few extra things in there. So maybe a 4-parter. We might be able to do it in 3. We'll see how we get on. There are a lot of knights. Last time I vastly underestimated how long it was going to take me to get through the 100 failed careers in Electric Bastionland, and there's probably more to talk about with each of these knights. But yeah, we'll try and do 72 knights next week. So that will be same time next week. Until then, if you missed the video at the start, I am going to play it again because I made the music for this. I did the video. I did the voice acting. So obviously the art is by Alex Sorensen, so I can't take the credit for that. I will play that to play us out. But until next time, it's goodbye for now.
On cold misted hills, beast witsome and fell, in holdings and havens their vassals adwell. Seeth no the all, the start and the end, myths hushed aloud, to which truth must append. Most of days my nothing awaits, no treasure or fame heard from sea-bound fates, a sorry life wasted on cut sullen ground, drowned in past smoke of tomorrows unfound. What of the city, what of the call? Mine ears now ring clearly, unfettered by all. In greyhood those troubles are shed like a blossom, fall to the ground as my deeds go forgotten. Yet more is unmade than my own petty story. Celestian watchers care nothing for glory. The waters are scattered, the land torn to waste. Sky shrinking past me with unearthly haste. flares of man glow the gleamers are high. Lanterns as gods that see myth as a lie. I witnessed the folly of old battles fought. Only stars now, the city is naught. Aside vagabonds on snakery trails, nights render these stories are wrenched from their veils. For the oath, for the glory, through sorrow and age, the city, that quest to which no knight